Cristo Redentor, braços abertos sobre a Guanabara.
Do lado de cá. Do lado de cá. Não tem caô. Do lado de cá. Da zona sul à zona norte.
Olá, ouvintes da Central 3. Hoje é quarta-feira, 30 de outubro de 2018. E estou aqui no estúdio Mané Garrincha, sede da Central 3, para gravar um Lado B do Rio muito diferente. Como o Caio e Fagner pediram de férias e o Daniel tá viajando, eu precisei arrumar uns panelistas step para manter o programa no ar essa semana. Como diria o Fagner, o inglesinho aqui resolveu aprontar. Eu vou pedir desculpas adiantadas aos ouvintes porque esse lado B vai ter que ser em inglês. Mas não se preocupem porque tudo será transcrito e publicado em parceria com a editora Boitempo em breve e quando esse programa for ao ar, um resumo do que foi dito vai estar no nosso site bonitinho. O motivo disso é muito simples, a convidada não fala a língua de Camões. Mas antes de chegar nela, o painel provisório do dia. Além do Yamin nas carrapetas, tenho o prazer de receber Alex Hochouli, apresentador do programa Auf the Bunga Bunga. Olá, Alex.
Oi, tudo bem?
Bom, o Alex, apesar de ser brasileiro, ele tem esse incrível sotaque maravilhoso. Fala alguma coisa pro pessoal saber quem você é, o que você faz?
Oi, eu sou Alex, eu sou escritor, pesquisador, moro em São Paulo, mas cresci na Europa. Eu sou anfitrião do podcast Auf the Bunga Bunga e eu escrevo sobre política brasileira e especialmente antipolítica brasileira, que sobretudo me interessa aqui.
Bom, nesse momento eu vou deixar o espaço para a mensagem do Fagner, que vai ser cortado maravilhoso depois lá no nossas edições. E depois a gente volta.
Olá a todos e todas, bom momento. Como combinado ainda antes do segundo turno, hoje o Lado B vai ter uma edição especial, só com o nosso âncora Alciso Canete, que entrevistará uma convidada diretamente da Inglaterra, para poder falar sobre, entre outras coisas, desafios da esquerda no mundo, né? De alguma maneira no mundo. Bom, eu sou Fagner Torres, como vocês já devem ter reconhecido, e vim aqui para deixar o meu recado para vocês nesse programa. Em primeiro lugar, agradecer todas as mensagens de carinho que todos nós recebemos nos últimos dias, pela circunstância que acontece no Brasil. Muitos ouvintes preocupados com o que está acontecendo e também preocupados conosco, né? Porque sabem de nossa militância, sabem do nosso engajamento para a construção de um país mais justo e digno para todos. E creio eu que imaginaram que estivéssemos muito tristes, né, com o acontecimento do último domingo. Realmente estamos tristes, estamos preocupados com o país, mas a luta não pode parar, né? A gente tem que, a partir de agora, ter muita sabedoria, refletir. Acho que o momento pede muita reflexão para que a gente consiga pensar e agir de maneira inteligente nesse novo modelo de governo, diria eu, que provavelmente será implantado no Brasil a partir do dia 1º de janeiro de 2019. Muito provavelmente um modelo híbrido de gestão do país, que, como já dissemos aí nos nossos programas passados, tem como objetivo a implantação de um Estado ultraliberal, né, que com isso finalizaria com praticamente todas as garantias sociais que nós, povo brasileiro, conquistamos ao longo dos últimos anos, né, das últimas décadas. E isso pede que tenhamos muita sabedoria nas formas de luta, né? Creio eu que mais do que nunca será preciso voltar e intensificar o trabalho de base, né? Conversar com a mesma base que elegeu Jair Bolsonaro democraticamente, ouvi-las, sobretudo, né? Ouvi-las por que tomaram dessa decisão, ouvir o que eles esperam, não só do novo governo, mas esperam do país, e conjuntamente construir uma alternativa a esse modelo que, a meu ver, já nasce fracassado, né? Eu acho que o tempo vai comprovar que nós, do campo democrático popular, estávamos certos na análise que fazíamos, né, do projeto que Jair Bolsonaro representa para o Brasil. Nada mais, nada menos do que o esgarçamento do tecido social de uma maneira completa, no que ainda não sabemos no que vai dar. Provavelmente em muita insatisfação popular, muita insatisfação social, e acho que quando isso acontecer, nós do campo democrático devemos estar preparados para poder servirmos de alternativa a essa grande massa de insatisfação, né? Vamos pensar que aquilo que está ruim sempre pode piorar. Então, Bolsonaro, por mais que pareça, não é o fundo do poço. Existem ainda coisas que podem piorar além dele. Então, devemos estar preparados para, quando a oportunidade vier, nós possamos servir de alternativa a essa insatisfação popular que certamente virá. Bom, dito isso, eu desejo um bom programa a vocês. Quero agradecer a todo mundo, todos os ouvintes e não ouvintes que acreditaram no modelo inclusivo de democracia, né? A gente sabe que essa democracia burguesa não é o modelo ideal, não é aquilo que nós almejamos, mas diante do que foi o segundo turno, um segundo turno que representou basicamente a civilização contra a barbárie, eu queria agradecer a todos aqueles que ficaram do lado da civilização, que foram para as ruas tentar virar votos, que ficaram nas redes conversando com as pessoas, que acreditaram que o novo Brasil pode ser possível, né? A partir de agora surge um novo momento e cabe a nós termos muita sabedoria, muita reflexão, para que no momento oportuno a gente possa novamente ser uma alternativa de governo popular e soberano, protegendo o Brasil, protegendo as minorias, protegendo as nossas riquezas naturais, né, das mãos dos grandes especuladores, do capital estrangeiro, né, e das forças mais autoritárias que existem nesse país. A todos um bom programa e até a próxima. Um abraço.
Bom, a parte do programa em português vai acabar nesse momento. Um resumo do que foi conversado vai para o site, como eu já falei, e novamente eu peço desculpa pela barreira linguística, mas não havia como superar a dificuldade técnica com dublagem, porque a gente é ruim nisso. A nossa convidada de hoje é a jornalista e ativista do Partido Trabalhista Inglês, Ellie Mayo-Hagan. Hi, Ellie.
Hi.
So, Ellie, we're going to start from the beginning to understand how things worked in the Labour Party in the last few years, okay? So, can you tell us how did the consensus around Blair and the Blairism went down?
You mean how it failed?
Yes.
God, that's a long question. Well, if we go back to the 1980s, in the 1980s, the Labour Party had a left-wing leadership. It wasn't as left-wing as the leadership that we have now. And they produced a left-wing manifesto in the 1983 general election. And it was described as the longest suicide note in history because it was thought that the public would reject it. And they did. And some people say that's because it was too left-wing. Other people say it was because the party split into two parties, which split the votes. Other people say it was because of the Falklands War at the time. But in any case, they lost the election. The left kind of went on a downward spiral in the 80s and was eventually replaced by what we now know as Blairism. And that was extremely dominant in the party for over 10 years. There was never any doubt that Tony Blair would win, really, the three elections that he won, and that he would remain as leader until he decided to step down. And what really shattered that consensus was, I would say it's the first thing that shattered it was the financial crisis. I think that was the big cataclysm that destroyed the political consensus that kept Blairism in place. And that's because Blairism argued that we were living in a society where everybody shares the same interests. And the purpose of the government is to help everybody move in a direction where everybody can benefit. So, for example, in Tony Blair's leadership speech in 1996, he said, "No more worker against boss, we're all on the same side." And obviously what 2008 showed us is that actually we weren't on the same side, that actually there was a group of people who were getting incredibly rich at the expense of everybody else. And their recklessness and greed destroyed the financial system in our country and, of course, across the world. So it really demonstrated that the entire ideology that Blairism was based on wasn't true. But also, adding on to that, the material circumstances around British people completely deteriorated after the financial crisis. Wages stagnated, the cost of living went up, and nobody who caused the crisis was given any kind of punishment. And obviously Blair wasn't in power then, but the consensus that he'd established remained, that you have to win elections from the centre, that you can't be too radical, that you need to have a little bit of capitalism and a little bit of socialism and sort of liberalism all mixed together. And that's how you win elections. So within the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, who I think is someone who got into politics for the right reasons, tried to depart from Tony Blair and take the party in a more left-wing direction. But he was kind of under the spell of the consensus that Tony Blair had created. So he was trying to look like he came from the centre, even though he was trying to take the party to the left. And he appeared very indecisive. And within the party, the left sort of accepted the argument that you had to appear as though you were in the centre in order to win. So they sort of accepted Ed Miliband, even though they were very distressed by what was happening to the economy at the time. And even though they felt that Ed Miliband should have been more to the left than he was. So after accepting that you needed to win from the centre and accepting that Ed Miliband was the best candidate because he would appear as a sort of centre-ground social democrat, the Labour Party then lost another election to the Conservative Party in 2015. And this was also when the polls predicted that Labour would win. So losing that election was not just devastating for the Labour Party because it was a loss, but also because it was extremely unexpected. People thought that Ed Miliband would become Prime Minister. And I think what you saw after that is two things happened. The first is that long-term Labour supporters would just said to themselves, OK, we're not willing to tolerate candidates who don't represent us anymore. We need to vote in a left-wing candidate who does represent us. We don't care about, the game, the political game. And the second thing that happened is that in the years between the financial crisis and the 2015 general election, a whole generation of young people had grown up with lost opportunities, with poor-paying work, with an inability to own property. And they had been looking for a sort of radical place that they could pin their politics to. So they tried the Liberal Democrats in 2010 when the Liberal Democrats agreed to abolish university tuition fees. And then the Liberal Democrats went into coalition with the Conservatives and disappointed their supporters. They tried the Green Party in 2015, but the Green Party is a very marginal party and was never going to take power. So then when Jeremy Corbyn became leader, they sort of attached themselves to him. And that's really how he came to power and how the consensus that Blair had built within the party and also within the country that really came to an end. That was a very long answer.
No, it was great. I'm just pointing to Alex. I think he wanted to
I just wanted to maybe add a bit of color, perhaps, to what to your description, Ellie, which I think was absolutely correct. I wouldn't dissent from that in any way. But I guess for Brazilian listeners especially, I think it's important to understand that Britain, probably more than any other European country even, the neoliberal counter-revolution was more complete, thorough, and abrupt than anywhere else. So the period of the 90s and 2000s was a real period of post-history in Britain. There was very little... in comparison to Brazil even, there was very little sense of political debate, political contestation. Everything was transposed onto a sort of cultural plane because the economics of the way that society was governed was completely decided upon. I think one of the ironies of this is that it allowed the Labour Party to then become a vehicle for Corbynism in a way that in other European countries it hasn't been. Because what's happened in other European countries is that neoliberalism, the neoliberal counter-offensive, counter-revolution, wasn't so complete. It was a little bit more of a drip-feed effect, for example, as in France. And what happened was that the main centre-left party ended up having a breakaway left party from it. And then that gained a lot of the left-wing energies. This happened in Germany, happened to an extent in France, happened in other European countries. Whereas in Britain, I think that the defeat was so total that it left this hollow edifice of a Labour Party as the only kind of party potential with potential to become a vehicle for left-wing politics still standing. And then that allowed a moment when the full consequences of the 2008 financial crisis started to hit to become that vehicle.
Yeah. Moving forward, I would like to know, you spoke about how the people attached themselves to several parties and ended eventually attached to Corbynism. How did these people organize outside the parties and switched? Was it organic or was it organized by themselves?
Yeah, it was. So basically, I think there's lots of different things happened at once here. I think in the 2011 in Britain, 2010, 2011, there was a big movement against austerity because the way that Britain responded, more than anywhere else in Europe, except for possibly Greece, the way that Britain responded to the financial crisis was to cut public spending massively. So each government department had at least 25% of its budget cut, I think was the statistic. So the cuts that the British economy has seen they've just been phenomenal. And when those were first suggested, there was a movement in this country against austerity. And what you saw was a lot of young people who'd learned how to do activism. I was actually one of them. Through that anti-austerity movement, lots of students, lots of young people joining student occupations in universities and marching on the streets, and like I did, taking direct action. So there were already sort of networks in place by the time Corbyn ran as leader that could then be used to sort of campaign for him. And also, John McDonnell, who is, of course, Corbyn's deputy, the Shadow Chancellor, when lots of the activists, including myself, were arrested in 2011 as a part of their protesting, John McDonnell would be very publicly supportive of protesters. In fact, I wasn't put on trial, but in the arrest that I was part of, some other people were put on trial, and John McDonnell spoke in court to support them. So these were people who already had a lot of goodwill on the left, and these were networks that already existed. So when Corbyn he ran for leader, there were things like phone banking and sort of leafleting and campaigning that all needed to be done. That were done by these young people who'd come in from these networks. You know, I know people who were living in anarchist communes who sort of came away from those anarchist communes to phone bank for Jeremy Corbyn and who now work in Westminster. You know, so so it was really like, because Jeremy and John had existed on the left for such a long time, they'd sort of built these relationships, and then so they had a lot of trust on the left. So then all of the people on the left who knew them already sort of sprung into action. And all of the young people who were angry about austerity and had tried to do something then also sprung into action. I think the other thing that happened is that a lot of older people who had who joined the Labour Party in the sort of 70s and 80s under Thatcher and left because of Blair, because they were upset about mainly the Iraq War, but also his economic policies, rejoined under Jeremy Corbyn. And so that then sort of created, accidentally almost, a movement to support him. And then once he was in power, once he did win the leadership, the people who had been sort of trying to manage that movement founded Momentum, because they believed that they didn't want to sort of lose all of the energy that had been built up around getting him into the position of leader. They wanted to turn it into an organisation that could keep him in power and also make sure that he stayed on the left of the party, because obviously, you know, the forces of neoliberalism would try to push him rightwards. So that's really what happened there.
So Momentum is sort of an organic grassroots movement that pushes the Labour Party to the left, right?
Yeah, it's like a caucus, but it wasn't set up. It was set up organically. It wasn't something that was already in place. It was an attempt to capture the energy of a movement that sort of seemed to be very spontaneous and turn it into something permanent. So yeah, it acts as a caucus within the party. So its aim is to keep Labour on the left and to recruit new people to the party, and to, you know, do normal caucusing things like, you know, if there's sort of elected positions within the party, your Momentum will put together a left slate and will encourage its members to vote for the Momentum slate to make sure that people on the left are in positions of power in the party.
Also, this movement is in most of movement they joined Labour Party, right? So their main goal is to push from outside and from the inside to take, let's say, the remainders of the Blair era out. And I've seen some things about campaigning against MPs that are still attached to Blair and refuse to vote with Jeremy Corbyn, etc. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of controversy in Britain over that, because in the 80s, obviously, you know, it's the establishment protecting itself as well. But in the 80s, there was a faction that infiltrated the Labour Party and caused a lot of damage called Militant. And so when Momentum founded, lots of people, you know, particularly like the establishment media, were saying this is just militant again, and they're going to kind of terrorize people and cause problems. And so Momentum's had to deal with very carefully the prospect of, the word that we use here is like deselecting, which basically means that, because if in this country, if you are an MP, every time there's an election, you just automatically stand again as the MP. You don't go through, it's not like a primary system in the US where you have to be re-elected every time. And obviously, and there's some seats like the one that I live in London, where 85% of people living there will vote Labour. So if you become a Labour MP in that seat, you basically will have a job for life. And Momentum has had to sort of tread very carefully, but it's been trying to change the rules of the party to make sure that the MPs can't do that basically there's some way of getting rid of MPs if members feel that they're not doing their jobs properly. And they did achieve some kind of rule changes at the last Labour Party conference to make that process a bit easier.
So how are things standing inside the Labour Party now? How would you qualify Jeremy Corbyn's hold of the party? Would you say he's...
It's total. It's absolutely complete. Like it will take a lot to get rid of him, a lot, for lots of reasons. The first is that the bureaucracy of the Labour Party is now controlled by the left. So the Labour Party has its sort of elected MPs, and it has its members, and it has its sort of shadow cabinet. So the shadow cabinet are like the top level MPs. Then you have all of the other MPs, and then you have members. But as well as that, it also has a bureaucratic side. So it has an executive committee and lots of different panels that sort of manage different things in the parties, like the rules of how the party runs, and like things like if there's a complaint made against a member, it goes through these sort of democratic committees. And basically, all of those committees are now, so the vast majority of the members are all supportive of Corbyn. And all of those committees are now pretty much supportive of Corbyn. And also, and the MPs there are still some MPs that are hostile to him. But a lot of the ones that are hostile to him are starting to leave, and they're being replaced by people who aren't hostile towards him. And if there's another election, I think that trend will continue. Similarly, a lot of people are starting to run as councillors who are supportive of him at a local level. So the left's domination of the Labour Party now is very concrete. I mean, I think possibly a general election could change. If there was a general election and Labour did awfully, that could change it. But as things are now, he has complete control over the Labour Party, really.
Ellie, this is Alex. I wanted to ask, it seems to me that one of the strengths of Momentum has been its internal focus on winning the battle within the Labour Party, assuring Corbyn's hold over the Labour Party, as well as the campaigning that it does. But I think that sort of internal focus of winning the battle within the party has been its primary strength. But now that that job is to a large extent complete, as the way that you put it, what do you think Momentum's next steps are? I mean, what would it look like to turn outwards? Does it have a political role other than just campaigning in kind of grassroots terms?
I think Momentum. First of all, I would disagree with you that its job is over, because there's still the issue of selecting candidates for seats. So there's lots of candidates that have already been selected for seats, because obviously if you run against in a seat and you lose, then the seat goes to selection again. So so that's still something that has to be done. There's going to be, there's lots of candidates to still be chosen, lots of local government issues to still work on. And even though Jeremy Corbyn does, he is sort of very, very safe now, there are still some MPs who don't like him being there. So Momentum still has a role there. But I think the other strength of Momentum, and, I'm very impressed with Momentum as an organisation, actually. The other strength that it has is it has an incredible command of social media. So that's one of the things that I think that it will focus on is creating like short films, information to be shared across the internet. So, for example, the McDonald's workers in Britain were on strike last year, and Momentum created a short film about the strike that was seen by 1 in 4 British Facebook users. So that's another element of Momentum's work that I think is really successful. And so it's campaigning on issues that the Labour Party is working on, campaigning against the Conservative Party, but also trying to push the Labour Party on certain issues to take a better direction. And then also the Labour Party, Momentum has been running training exercises for its members about how to canvass, has been trying to turn people from kind of armchair supporters into activists. And that runs alongside a programme the Labour Party itself is doing, where it's trying to increase community participation and organisation. I think the Momentum's long-term goal is to transform the Labour Party into a genuinely democratic movement, and that hasn't been complete yet. So I think that's another thing that it's working on.
So one of the main reasons I called you to talk, Ellie, is because in Brazil, the main centre-left party, which is PT, had a lot of internal issues in their election, because the main candidate, Fernando Haddad, was kind of hampered by the party leader, Gleisi Hoffmann. So, Alex, you that know a bit of both sides, do you see those parallels and the need for Haddad to listen a bit to what they did in Britain and try to implement the same inside the party?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps the greatest point of contact between the two parties in this regard is the way in which it faced a fork in the road. I mean, in this election, Haddad was, on the one hand, wanting to appease more middle-class or more centrist voters, wanting to present himself as nothing to do with PT, to avoid the taint of PT, which is responsible for everything horrible and terrible that's ever happened in Brazil, according to the main media narrative. And the other road would be to reapproximate the party and himself to the party's working class base, and to focus on jobs and economic growth, and certainly a more radical sort of approach than trying to appease the media and the potential middle class voters. And I think Labour kind of faced this as well. I actually think Labour faces this in a way which maybe I'm kind of interested also to hear what, Ellie, you think about this. But on the issue of Brexit, that Labour is to an extent torn between its predominantly working class and northern voters who are pro-Brexit, and middle class and southern voters who are campaigning often for a second referendum, trying to, if not to push a hard Remain position, at least to soften a potential hard Brexit. And so there's this sense of which side do you go to, and I think, my instincts would always be to follow the more radical approach, and to try to approximate oneself to one's original base, rather than try to chase after more fleeting middle class voters.
I sort of agree with that. I think the thing is that actually, I wouldn't describe the voters in Hackney, for instance, which is where I live. I wouldn't describe the voters there as sort of fleeting middle class. So I live in a ward at the moment. I'm at home at the moment, and 31% of the children in the area that I live in Hackney live in poverty. So I wouldn't say that
I lived in Hackney for 12 years, actually, so I'm familiar with the area itself. Yeah.
So you know what I mean, right? That I think it's not really accurate to say that working class people voted for Brexit and middle class people didn't.
Sure.
I think actually the divide is more kind of rural places and suburbs voted for Brexit, and sort of inner city areas, with a few exceptions, voted to remain. So I think it's not quite as simple as that. I think the sort of support that Labour has in places like Manchester, Liverpool, inner London is actually very, very solid, and is underpinned by working class people. And these are all places that voted to remain very strongly. However, I think that the Labour Party at the moment is kind of doing the only thing that it can do, which is to basically just say, we don't know what's going to happen yet. We're keeping all options on the table. But the most important thing is that we're going to protect the lives of working people, whatever happens with Brexit. And that really is the only way that it can cope with this, because, as you say, people living in sort of towns in England and parts of Wales that are very strong Labour supporting towns voted to leave the EU very enthusiastically. So Labour can't just go against what they asked for, but also, the sort of official position of the Labour Party is that it's a Remain party all of its most vocal activists, all of the pressures on the party, its MPs, the trade unions, its members all want to stay in the EU. So it is a difficult dilemma. And I think really the option, the way that it's responding to that, which is basically saying we're leaving all our options open, is the only way that it can move forward, really. And I would add, I mean, I know this isn't what you asked, but I would add that I think one issue that we do have in this country is that Brexit has strangled our politics completely. We just don't talk about anything else, really. We just talk about Brexit. It's become this kind of shadow that sort of dominates everything, which is really frustrating because there are so many issues in this country that need addressing. But at the moment, that has become the overwhelmingly dominant issue that we all talk about.
We see the SPD in Germany pretty much dead. The Socialist Party in France, it's not doing great either. The Italian Social Democrats are also pretty poor. And we also see like Podemos making a coalition in Spain. The Labour Party, now that's reinvigorated to the left, doing great. In France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is probably the main runner-up, the main candidate for the next election, because they're already talking about it, because Macron is already doing pretty bad. So would you say that centrism is dead?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course it is. I mean, I just don't see how anybody could argue anything else. If you look across the Western world, and unfortunately, Brazil is like a great example of this because, you had Cardoso was one of the, sorry about my pronunciation, was one of the sort of leading lights of the third way movement. He used to have dinner with the Clintons and the Blairs and Anthony Giddens, who was the father of sort of modern social democracy. And now he's just been replaced. Well, obviously he's not been replaced, but, now you've got a fascist in power, which I think sort of demonstrates how dead that movement is and how much that country has changed. And it's the same in the US. I think people forget how blasphemous it was at one time to have a president even saying critical things about NATO. Now that's completely over. Of course it's dead. People often hold Macron up as this sort of this kind of hope that centrism is still alive. But I think, as far as I can see, the only reason that Macron won is partly because he insisted that he was a radical and distanced himself from all establishment parties, and partly because he ran against an actual fascist in a country that was occupied by the Nazis not too long ago. And he's now the most unpopular figure in French history. So, of course, centrism is dead. And why would it not be? The political and economic conditions that allowed it to thrive have completely died. So why would it be alive, and how could it revive itself at this point when none of the conditions that we live in would enable that?
I totally agree with that, but I think I would bring this back to Brexit and would use this as an opportunity to highlight the degree to which the left must strike when the iron is hot, that when the centre falls away and that the broad mass of people are very hungry for some quite radical change, sometimes more radical even than much of the left is willing to go for at that moment, that the left has to be attuned to that. So I think, in the case of Britain, I understand the internal difficulties within the Labour Party of fully supporting Brexit at a time when many of its activists and many of the forces, the more kind of centrist labour unions are against a hard Brexit. But I think it is first of all, the mandate is there for it, and secondly, it is a great opportunity to break with the most important institutional force, which is restraining radical politics in Europe. And I think you see that, in Jean-Luc Mélenchon's force in part is because he's willing to be critical of the EU, and there where left parties are unwilling to be fully critical of the EU, as in Italy, they get totally decimated. All the energy which should be going to the left at this moment of European crisis is ending up being conquered by the populist right. I mean, there's a reason that Lega, for example, in Italy, is starting to win voters in southern Italy, even which was way beyond its natural constituency. I think in Britain, Labour, if it is not to lose all the energy that it has been able to absorb and conquer, it needs to support Brexit. To bring it to Brazil, I mean, it's a completely different context. So, what kind of lessons can you draw? What kind of parallels can you draw? I'm not going to try to suggest that these things are are entirely applicable, because the EU situation in Europe is something which is very unique to that continent. There is no correlate in South America. But what there is that if one thing that Bolsonaro's election shows us, as tragic as it is that there is a great mass of people willing to vote for something which might even be potentially horrible, but they're willing to roll the dice on some radical change which is going to sweep away all the messy compromises and corruption of the previous era. So, although most working class people voted for Haddad, it's still a fact that Bolsonaro was able to win certain support amongst the working class and the poor, on the basis of, one, security, but also that he represented something new, something different. That's very problematic, but that's something that the left, I think, has to be conscious of and has to be willing to face up to and deal with. What is the answer to that? I think, they ran the election in part saying, we're going to bring back the good old times, we're going to go back to the 2000s. That worked for some people, but not. He
said, we're going to go back to 1964.
Well, yeah, which is obviously a disaster, but there's a reason that let's go back to the 2000s didn't have that big appeal, because for a lot of people it was, yes, things improved, but they could have been so much better, and there's still a sense of abandonment from a lot of working class people on the part of PT, and those people need to be won back, and this would have been a moment for PT to have been more radical. It might have still lost, but at least to have been brave and to focus on who its natural constituency is, rather than trying to appease all sides and doing neither.
Do you think Fernando Haddad is the man for that?
Look, I quite like him personally. I don't think politically he's the man for it. I don't think he has quite the leadership potential to do that, and is also someone who politically isn't on that wing of the party.
Since we're already talking about the fascists to be elected, we in Brazil, we tend to put ourselves down a lot, say we're not important, nobody cares about what happens here. How did Bolsonaro's win reverberate in the UK, Ellie?
In terms of on the left, it was like utter horror. I mean, that was why I was very keen to do this podcast, because I think there's a feeling on the left at the moment of a lot of solidarity with leftists there, fear, horror, revulsion. So I think that's how the left responded. In terms of the sort of I think I would say that people who aren't political, they did notice, and for a sort of foreign election that isn't in Europe or America, for British people to notice, that's unfortunately quite unusual. And it was sort of definitely greeted with sort of fear and anxiety and sadness. In terms of the establishment, I feel like that the response was quite lazy. There was a lot of eagerness to portray him as Brazil's Trump, which I think is partly a reflection of just the kind of America-centric foreign interests of Britain, as in the USA, when I say America, and also sort of just ignorance. And there was a sort of an eagerness by the press to kind of just focus very specifically on all of the appalling things that he's said over the years, presenting him as a kind of controversial buffoon like Trump, as opposed to examining the kind of political, social and cultural changes that he will bring about, the militarization, the kind of possible persecution of leftists, that kind of thing. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago for a news channel here, and and I talked primarily about the possible persecution of leftists after his election, and that was sort of greeted with sort of embarrassment, and they kind of preferred to talk about all of the bad things that he said over the years. So I would imagine it's probably the same all over, which is that the establishment is just not equipped to deal with a fascist, and it's sort of been much the same in Britain. What I would say is that the left is paying a lot of attention, and of course the left now means the leader of the opposition party, which is one of the biggest political parties in Western Europe. And you know, I've spent a lot of my career reporting on, writing about and following Latin American politics, and so I do feel confident that the left in Britain won't look away and will keep paying attention and keep trying to figure out ways that we can support Brazilians who want to resist what's happening.
Yeah, it's very important to highlight that although he is definitely way to the right from the current man in charge because he wasn't elected to be the president, the Congress is already voting stuff for him. Just today they tried to vote to expand our anti-terror law to include an article that says that anyone who protests against someone being arrested, i.e. perhaps Lula, is going to be arrested, can be considered a terrorist act. So there is a clear movement to try to criminalize PT, PSOL and other parties together, because PSOL is trying to... There is a whole campaign to free a kid called Rafael Braga, who was arrested with a bottle of bleach in a protest in 2013, and he spent 4 years in jail and was convicted twice for nothing. So whenever we protest for him to be free, that's also a crime. And they're trying to pass an anti-communism law that if you talk about class struggle, there's going to be, criminal offense also. So yeah, we're gonna need a lot of support, and it's going to start just right now. It won't wait till January to start. It's very important to highlight this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
well,
I have been talking. I mean, in fact, I recorded a podcast, my own, yesterday, emphasizing exactly how important it will be to have solidarity from abroad, and I think Britain's very important in this, precisely because it is the only place with, certainly the only place in Europe really with an actual left-wing party on the verge of power, even if elections might be a little ways away, and with a certain weight and influence around the world. Perhaps not so much with Brazil immediately, because Britain and Brazil don't especially have very strong links. There's a great deal of awareness of what's going on in Brazil in the UK. I actually just received a text message from a friend of mine yesterday just saying, and I tell him a lot about what's going on in Brazil, but he goes, you know what, there's basically no coverage of Brazil on the election here. I haven't seen anything on BBC News. Now, I don't know to what extent that's true, but I think there is perhaps less awareness of what's going on in Brazil, in Britain, than maybe some other areas of the world which Britain has more contact with, perhaps in Africa or Asia. But I think the influence that Corbyn and Corbynism has on the left elsewhere in the world, because of the kind of flag that it's raised, will be very important in solidarity with Brazil.
Well, yeah, of course, Jeremy Corbyn has personal connections to Latin America. His current wife is a Mexican. I think his wife before that was Chilean. Both of his sons speak fluent Spanish. He spends a lot of time on that continent. I know it's an entire continent, so you can't talk about it in such general terms. But I do feel hopeful that he's paying attention. And I think just the level of just the sheer extreme, the extremes of what's happening, it's so much worse than America. I think that now you've got Trump in the US and Modi in India. so it does feel like there's a sort of global movement of right-wing authoritarians now, and I think there is definitely a sense on the British left that things are getting very real, and we need to do something. So I could only promise you that I will not look away from this, and I will not let the left in this country look away from this. And I know that other people feel the same way as I do.
So what advice you could give to our listeners and people who are reading this transcript to how to engage into politics if they want to resist this right-wing wave?
You mean people who have not taken part in any activism, or?
I would say people of all kinds. I think lots of people began to engage right at the end of the election. We saw a big movement of people who literally became desperate to the prospect of Bolsonaro being president, and now are vying to do more. And people who already are activists but feel like disenfranchised by their own party, perhaps.
So I think the most important thing I think to do if you want to be an activist is that you need to join or build a community. Because if there are organizations that are already in place, join them. If there aren't, try to form them with people that you feel share your beliefs and share your political aims. And try to use those organizations to build a community. That's how I got involved in activism, and I think that's how most people that I know have got involved in activism, is by either setting up movements or joining movements that already exist. And I think that sometimes on the left, I think this is one huge thing that we've learned from the Labour Party, actually, and from the Corbyn project, is that actually, like, oftentimes these institutions, these organizations that the left has set up are not perfect. Sometimes they're, like, really frustrating. Sometimes the people that you have to organize alongside are dicks. Sometimes it's tiring and, makes you feel hopeless. But tough, like that, if that's what you have, then you join it and you work hard and you make it better. And that's what's happened to the Labour Party, is that you now have, people joining local Labour Party meetings and sometimes finding them extremely frustrating and falling out with having arguments with people and, finding it difficult. But also, like, actually changing things and actually feeling part of a movement and something bigger than themselves, and making friends through that. Like I live with somebody that I met as a result of the Corbyn movement and getting involved in my local Labour Party again. And before that, I lived with somebody who I met through anti-austerity activism. So that would be my advice: is join institutions and organizations of the left. Deal with their imperfections, build them, and if they don't exist where you are, try to form new ones, and build a community. And it will be difficult, but it will also probably be one of the most worthwhile things you've ever done, which is how it's been for me. Obviously, I know that the stakes for Brazilians are very different to British people. Now you have an authoritarian in power. But I mean, that is the advice that I would give based on my experience. I'm afraid I don't have any experience of trying to organize in the conditions that you now exist in. So I wouldn't want to tell you how to organize yourselves in that respect.
I think there might be if I may, some lessons to go in reverse as well. I mean, or at least maybe some parallels to draw based on Brazil's experience under the PT, which might be applicable to Labour, to an eventual Labour government. I think sometimes the left underestimates the degree to which its policies resonate with people. And I think a great lesson of Corbynism has been that, no, there is a basic majority for social democratic policies that exist. Most people want labour rights defended. Most people want a degree of redistribution. They want public services. They don't want privatisation. These are things which Britain has shown us very well. And I think the left elsewhere should take heed to not be cowed, to not assume that most working class people are kind of secret neoliberals. No, not on the contrary. There is basic support for the kind of a basic social democratic package. And I think that's the case in Brazil too. I think even in this election, most of Haddad's policies would resonate with people, with the majority of people. But there was this taint of PT, the brand of the party had become tainted. Okay, partly that's due to a huge amount of right-wing propaganda from the big media saying that PT is responsible for all corruption.
And the cock pacifiers.
And the cock pacifiers, yeah. All the fake news, the tsunami of fake news suggesting that the Workers' Party was handing out gay kits to kids to teach them how to be gay, all this kind of nonsense. All that said, though, I think there has been a process in which PT has lost some credibility amongst its working class base. People have felt abandoned by the party, and I think it's important to remember that if a left party gets in power, the reason that it's there is to implement its program. If it can't implement its program, it should get out of power. Ruling just to hold on to power, hoping that you will be able to implement a softer form of austerity, a softer form of neoliberalism than the bad right-wing guys do, that ends up losing you a lot of credibility in the future. And that's what's happened. That's what happened especially with the second Dilma government. She implemented austerity, unemployment went up, and it lost a lot of working class support for PT. And I think that would be an interesting lesson to think about, I guess, in Britain going forward, that Corbyn should enter government with enthusiasm, with drive, with energy to see through what it considers to be its main policy proposals. And if it can't see those through, don't hold on to government for its own sake. That's something for the right. The right governs for its own sake. The left governs to implement its program.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
If people liked what you had to say, how are they going to find your podcast?
It's Auf Hebunga Bunga, which is not the easiest thing to search for in the world. But it's on Podbean. You can find it on Spotify, on iTunes, all the other usual outlets.
Ellie, thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
You do also have a podcast with Owen Jones, is that right?
Yes, it's called Agit Pod. It's actually on hiatus at the moment, but it will be back when Owen finally finishes his book.
So soon you can also listen to Ellie's podcast. So, bom, esse foi o Lado B especial. Você pode nos ouvir no site da Central 3, no seu tocador de podcast favorito e no Spotify. Siga-nos em todas as redes sociais. Lembrando que estamos no Instagram como Lado B do RJ. Boa noite a todos e muito obrigado por ter aguentado esse Lado B especial.